Hello there, my name is Dean Ramsden. I am a therapeutic energy healer, and today we're at episode 2 of my review and commentary on Hands of Light by Barbara Ann Brennan. And as I said in my first episode, this is really a very individual look at this important work as a foundational text for those of us in energy healing work that want to take a therapeutic approach, which means an approach that includes psychotherapy and a structured or stage-orientated method to personal growth, personal transformation, and also the healing process itself. We can actually apply this to a healing or medical situation without getting involved in diagnosis or interfering with the medical treatment of the client. And I'll go more into depth about that. But first of all, here we have the famous cover of Hands of Light. Now, if you're new to this kind of work, this might be look a little old, a little dated. It was written and produced in the middle and late 1980s. But as you'll see with many of the books that I'll review on this YouTube channel, the age of a book does not define its usefulness for us. In fact, often the older and more valued the work is, the more we can get from it. But we do have to go back in time a little bit and see this book through 30 years ago, when the world was very different. And we want to glean from it. We want to take from it that which we need for ourselves, whether as a professional healer, as a student of healing, or as a client. This book also very helpful for knowing what your healer is doing with you and when things are going right. And actually, sometimes when things are not going right, we need to know that so we can course correct. So we began with the dedications to the book. And for any book, a dedication and the way it's set up and presented, the table of contents, is the framework that we need as a scholar, as a student, to see where we're going and where we're going to end up. So let's jump now to the dedication and the table of contents. Get ready your own personal copy of Hands of Light. Have it ready for looking through. I'm using a PDF copy that I made from my original book. So we're here at the table of contents, and this gives us a overview of the territory. So Barbara organizes this book, Living on a Planet of Energy. This is really just an introduction to how she uses her healing work and her interaction with her spirit guide. And it also makes note of the fact that this book, Hands of Light, was actually designed to be a teaching manual. It was like a very, very large pamphlet of her teaching process. And we're very indebted to this process because it gives us a great starting place, foundational starting place as student healers. And if you've read this book before, as I have, as probably you have, reviewing it allows us to take who we are right now, which at the point of recording was 2023, take who we are, what we know now, and look back and refine, sift through the material. Not to critique it as much as to say, well, this now is more valuable than before, and this other thing perhaps not as valuable as perhaps it once was, and that we often find with many books that have become a little dated. Not particularly this one, but other books soon lose a certain relevance. But with Hands of Light, and later on with Light Emerging, Barbara's second book, we find plenty to dig and appreciate and build on. And that's the purpose of these videos, to shine a light on the value and what can be built on, both now and into the future. So back to the table of contents, part 1, living on a planet of energy. Let's go forward. I'm going to scoot forward here. And I'm just going to pause before we get into that, because in the Acknowledgements page, you find the major influences on Barbara's work. You find her acknowledgement of John Parakos. Barbara Brennan was a core energetic therapist, and before that, a pathwork helper. And to really deeply understand Barbara's approach to energy healing, you have to dip into, or at least be familiar with, the Pathwork Guide lectures and the core energetics approach to working with characterology and working with the therapeutic process. Now, when Barbara worked in the Pathwork spiritual tradition, she was what they refer to as a helper. Now, a helper is not so much a psychotherapist, but someone who knows the material well, someone who has lived the Pathwork Guide material well, and helps a fellow student, fellow traveler, understand and make sense of spiritual teachings. And in many ways, Barbara, I think, wanted to extend that helper idea to a therapeutic energy healer situation, where the energy healer was less of a psychotherapist and more of a helper, more of a guide, some traditions would call it a spiritual director, a mentor, if you went through college, someone who oversaw your progress and encouraged you, as well as cautioned you when necessary, to save you time and save you getting into trouble. So, in many ways, I think Barbara's creation of a therapeutic energy healing system was deeply resting on being a helper, more so than being a psychotherapist. Many energy healers are already psychotherapists. I have Hakomi training and other training that I've used and do use in my practice. But if you're already a psychotherapist, you can add the perspective of helpership into your model. And as we go through these books, I'll do my best to point out where I think things are helpful and where things can also go awry, where we can actually get into some challenges. But anyway, back to the acknowledgements, the basis for this book, where it's coming from. So we have John Parakos, we have Ava Parakos, who was the medium for the Pathwork Guide lectures. And from my conversations with Barbara, I know she felt very spiritually bonded, emotionally bonded with Ava Parakos, and felt that she was in that same lineage in some way, that she, as well as many other pathwork people, helpers and teachers, were in that same philosophical boat. So to understand Barbara Brennan, to understand Hands of Light and later Light Emerging, we have to look towards the Pathwork Guide material, and we have to look towards core energetics as the fundamentals. That being said, I myself, although I've studied all of these things in the past, I've kind of veered towards a different direction. I no longer consider the pathwork material as a primary source, but that's just me. You may be very different. You may be very knowledgeable and studying the pathwork material. Absolutely fine. Doesn't really impact us here with what we're doing with studying the book, but it provides a context. And in energy healing, everything is contextual. Everything is relational. And when we start assembling pieces together, pieces of information, pieces of long or well-known wisdom and things that work, then we have a functional system with a therapeutic approach to energy work. So John Parakos is essential. I remember Barbara proudly bringing John around the school when I think it was in New Jersey, but someone will correct me in the comments below where exactly John came around. And yes, it was a nice moment. Eva Parakos, of course, important. Also, very important here, the impact of Reverend Rosalind Bruyere, who is also one of my major teachers and primary influences. I actually studied with Barbara Brennan and Rosalind Bruyere concurrently at the same time. Very different approaches, and I found the complementary approaches very stimulating to my own process as a new healer, as a growing healer. So late 1980s, early 1990s. Barbara spent a little bit of time with Rosalind, not a lot. At that time, Rosalind Bruyere was teaching, I think mostly in California. Occasionally she would come to the East Coast. But she would teach in, and I think still does, intensives. So you go and study with her. Highly recommend that if you are a serious energy healing practitioner, student, please go study with Rosalind and her husband, Ken, and wonderful experience and highly recommended. But I digress. The impact of Rosalind is that Barbara took some of Rosalind Bruyere's fundamental techniques, which I'll talk about a little bit later, not in great detail, but and added it to the pathwork, added it to core energetics, and added it into this concept of a helper, as the healer as helper and guide to the client, ushering them, welcoming them, guiding them through a healing process, whether it's personal emotional healing, professional healing, professional concepts and ideas that the person was working with, and of course physical and physical healing process. All right, let's jump now to this little blurb here about the author. Barbara Brennan is a practicing healer and psychotherapist. Barbara's healing practice was only 5 years long. And it was combined with her pathwork helpership work in New York City and, I believe, in upstate New York. And it was also combined with her core energetics therapeutic practice. So, again, we have this synthesis, helper from a pathwork perspective, psychotherapy from a body-centered psychotherapy approach with core energetics, and the ever-growing impact of energy work and spirit world interaction. Coming through Barbara and starting the process here with Hands of Light. So out of those 5 years of being in private practice in New York City, Barbara then closed that practice and began teaching full-time. And in fact, for myself and many others, we were in the second class of Barbara's program, which swelled from only a few people with her early students to well over 100. I think it was 150 or something. Someone will correct me in the comments, I'm sure, the exact numbers of those. 1988 class, the class of 1988. Let's see who remembers that far back. Amazing days and amazing people. So let's stay focused here, Dean. Let's move into part one, living on a planet of energy. Now, this we could pause at because we could do a whole series just on how to look at our cones of perception. And Barbara writes about cones of perception later in the book. Our ability to perceive something through a particular sense, either through a regular, entrained sense, eyesight, touch, taste, sound. But then once we expand to the higher frequencies, the higher concepts of vision, touch, taste, sound, all the senses, we have what Barbara termed a higher sense perception, a perception of something beyond the normal. And having ourselves explore those senses, both normal and higher, allows us to create more room, more perception, more input to our own energy field. And from that, of course, we're led to perceiving and working with other people. As long as we follow certain therapeutic guidelines, such as not invading them and not exploiting them, all the usual therapeutic essentials. Again, we'll get into that later. Let's briefly look at page 3 here, the healing experience, because in these 3 short snippets of Barbara's healing career, we have an insight as to how she started out using a therapeutic approach to energy healing, which she later termed Brennan healing science. So she writes, my first client, October 1984, so very early on, I would suspect, in Barbara bringing together energy healing and her helper program, her core energetic experience. So in this, page 3 here, Barbara states that she saw some abnormal cells inside the uterus of her client, and she got guidance from her spirit guide that she gave to her client, Jenny. Pretty innocuous here. Take some time off, take some vitamins, go back and get retested to see what the medical situation is. Now, unless you have medical training yourself, unless you are licensed in some way, you should, of course, not give medical diagnosis or even interfere with the process between a patient and her doctor, his doctor. So medical diagnosis, I've always found, is not a good idea. It's just not a good idea. There are so many factors, not limited to the fact that it's illegal. It's practicing medicine without a license. And over and above the ethics and the legalities, it interferes. Giving a psychic diagnosis will interfere, in my opinion, with the whole process, the process of your client working with her physicians or in a medical situation, or you trying to find a helping, mentoring place for your client, who's also a patient, moving through their healing process. Now, this is not to discount the value of seeing something with high sense perception, and a viewer of this video may have very highly developed visual sense of of the energy field. Others may be auditory, pick up, as Barbara writes about on page 3 here of Hands of Light. She hears, she's told through her spirit guide or tutor guide. We can also have guides that tutor us, who train us, who lead us step by step through a process. So, big subject, but the bottom line here, since we're looking at Hands of Light, is that Barbara early on was trying to balance all these various inputs, including medical guidance. Let's move on to her second. So this is page 4 of Hands of Light. My second client that October day was Howard. And here we get another example of Barbara's combining different systems to get a synergistic result. So here Barbara talks about working with another healer that specialized in herbal medications, and the combination of doing hands-on healing plus the client receiving herbal support. Could be homeopathic support, it could be Bach flower remedies. You're bringing together the client's healing or emotional process with 2 different healing modalities: energy healing and herbal, or it could be diet. It could also be a dietary issue. It could also be a physical training, going to the gym, lifting things. More and more important, the older we get, to keep everything strong and flexible. In this beginning part of Hands of Light was seeing Barbara exploring different ways of using energy work in conjunction with other healing modalities. And that, again, is a powerful addition to complementary healing, as long as we don't stray into medical diagnosis or interfering with someone's medical treatment. The caveat being, of course, if you're a medical professional, have at it. But I remain very cautious and avoid diagnosis at all, to tell you the truth, even though I will get diagnosis and options through my guidance. I act as a sensor, as a filter for that, because I don't want to overstep my competence, my area of competence. You want to stay in your lane sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. Let's do number 3. Where are we? Oh, yes, this is really good. So this is at the bottom of page 4 of Hands of Light. Ed and unjamming the coccyx, realigning it through energy work, and bringing this, I believe it was an older gentleman, back to strength out of a place of weakness. So, once again, combining energy work with a physical structure, a realignment. Barbara, in my experience, was very strong, and quite rightly so, on having alignment, correct alignment within the body, and energy flows working together. And given the structure of core energetics, of course, that makes a lot of sense, since you want to invite flow where there's restriction. You want to increase flexibility where there's stiffness and rigidity. You want to get the organism, the physical organism, flowing and pulsing and alive and vital. So energy work in conjunction with that approach, very, very valuable, extremely valuable. And it's one of the things I miss in my long-distance private practice. I work over Zoom and do most of my astral work and energy healing work at a distance at this point. But I do miss that physical involvement with the body to do all these things, increase flexibility and strengthen in person. Combining energy work with physical effort, physical change. Now, so we've been through those three examples of Barbara using energy work in the early part of her practice, and it did change. As I said, it would become more clear about the right or wrong use of medical diagnosis, but also the application of energy work to medical treatment changes over time, because the more we understand how to support a healing process, which could also include supporting the medication or the medical protocol that the client is on, and supporting the client in a way that the doctor can't, energetically, emotionally, dare I say it, even at a spiritual, we're all in it together place. Doctor's not trained on that. Maybe some of you out there are, but most aren't, and it's not their wheelhouse. So you're, as an energy healer, as helper, interfacing with the medical system, interfacing with herbal, with different forms of other forms of healing, bringing them together, synthesizing, synergistically supporting each other. Very important. And the addition of energy work. So here in page 5, Barbara first writes, the process I use is called laying on of hands, faith healing, or spiritual healing. And she writes, it's not at all a mysterious process. I respectfully disagree, Barbara. It's a very mysterious process. Mysterious in that it's multi-layered, multidimensional. And I think in Hands of Light and later Light Immersion, Barbara wanted to create almost a pseudo-scientific structure which her students could interact with the medical profession in a more meaningful way. In the late 1980s and the 1990s, there was an opportunity to do that. The medical profession at that time was very open to complementary healing work, was looking for ways to expand the medical system. It has, of course, changed or contracted back to something very different right now, 2023. But when Hands of Light was written, it was being welcomed. Energy work was being welcomed. Other forms of complementary healing were being welcomed into society. And this book, I think, represents a major milestone in that attempt to make it more mainstream, make energy work less mysterious. And as Barbara writes here, it's very straightforward. The interesting thing, and I'll keep this video down to about 30 minutes. I don't want to ramble on too long. The words she uses are very interesting here on top of page 5. The process I use is called laying on of hands. Now, that's a very specific title for spiritualist healing. So I suspect this is probably directly from Rosalind Bruyere, who was a trained spiritualist, is a trained spiritualist healer and reverend, and is built into that Christian perspective of putting your hands on or above your client and allowing energy to flow to help them. Hence, the second term she uses here, faith healing. So it's part of your Christian faith that you will allow energy healing to come to your client. In effect, a form of prayer. And faith healing is a form of prayer for the client. And inviting yourself as healer to be a vehicle for something greater than you. And then the final term she uses, spiritual healing. Tricky because we don't want to define someone's spiritual journey. We don't want to define who they are versus the path they choose or the culture they were raised in. And we have to be careful with the spiritual healing because there is a lot of variety throughout the world for spiritual growth. And if you are going to help or mentor someone, you probably need to know know something about that tradition and hopefully even partaken in it, at least from the inside rather than just read about it. So in future videos, I want to talk more about this because we don't want to restrict our therapeutic energy work just to this laying on of hands or faith healing label. We want to open it up to many forms of the healing process, both built into certain traditions, disciplines, but also intuitively what can come from the spirit world to you, through you, that is unique perhaps to you or to the group that you're working with. We want to open as much as possible before we form a structure around it. And, in closure to this episode, I hope you can see that for Barbara Brennan, writing about this in the middle of the 1980s, she was supported by a movement to bring energy healing out into the world and have it combine with other modalities and ideally interface with the medical system. So that's all I've got for you today. Next time, episode 3, we will move more into how to use this book according to Barbara. Spoiler alert, you use it as a manual. You use it as a workbook. You use it to encourage yourself to go through certain experiences that will expand your perception, will expand your interest, and will fuel your curiosity for more. But for now, that's all I have. Thanks for listening, and see you next time. Bye for now.